I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
In our first study of Hebrews, remember that we saw that the author stated that Jesus was greater than the prophets. In Hebrews 1:1-3, we saw that. And then he approached the fact that Jesus was greater than the angels. Okay, and that was in verse 4, chapter 1, verse 4, and chapter 2 in verse 4. And for this reason, for those reasons thus far, he was trying to encourage the Hebrew Christians that they should continue to follow Jesus and not return to the Old Testament. And then we'll come back to this slide of comparing the priesthood of Jesus with the Levitical priesthood in a bit, because as Jared mentioned, Dave asked me about Moses. Well, Dave never had a question on Moses. So I wanted us to look then at how our author compares Jesus to Moses. And when you think about it now, like I say sometimes, we put ourselves into the shoes of the Jewish Christians and their upbringing. Moses stands out as the dominant figure in the Old Testament. And no prophet would be greater in the eyes of the Jewish people than their beloved and respected lawgiver, Moses. And think about it now, God chose him to lead the Hebrew people out of slavery. He revealed to Moses the 10 Commandments. He spoke with him directly, as remember the term face to face. That explains that God didn't appear to him in a vision or in a dream, such as Jacob and that. He spoke with Moses. And Moses completed his mission that God gave him by bringing Israel to the borders of the promised land. And think now, Moses was a prince of Egypt. He was a herdsman. That was a person that understood animals and breeding and their makeup. He was also a shepherd. He was a prophet. He was a lawgiver, and a covenant mediator also. And he was a national leader. And Scripture lays bare to us the great burdens that Moses had governing God's people. And yet our author is telling these Jewish Christians, and those of us that are living now also, that we should not forsake Jesus' words, and go back to Moses' teaching. So if you look at chapter 3, Hebrews 3, and we'll read the first 6 verses. I guess we'll start with you, Jaron. We'll just read a verse each till we get down to verse 6.
Therefore, holy brethren, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and the high priest of our confession,
who was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was faithful in all his house.
For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, by just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house.
For every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God.
And Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which would be spoken afterward.
But Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and the rejoicing of the hope firm to the end.
Okay, thank you. So we see here, First of all, the author is trying to show the Jewish brethren the difference between Moses and Christ. And he in no way undermines the glory that should be paid to Moses. He pays respect to everything that Moses has done. But he begins by saying there in the first couple verses, reminding the Hebrew Christians that they had believed in Christ to start with, they had obeyed his will, and they had put him on. And therefore, that's why they're referred to as holy brethren. And the heavenly calling, I just threw this in as a side thought. The heavenly calling just simply means a summons or an invitation. The gospel is the means of calling man to God. That's how God chose to do it. We've read that 1,000 times in our studies in 2 Thessalonians 2, in verse 13 and 14. But it's always used in the New Testament of the original calling. In other words, in its true nature and destiny. There are no new callings. Okay, I've talked with people that, well, God's called me in this way, and another God's called me in this way, and different religious groups say, well, God called their leader. Well, no. The heavenly calling went out on the day of Pentecost, is the way I put it. God is not revealing to anyone any new calling. He's done it, and he's done it in the manner that he wants. But the author wants us to give thoughtful attention, first of all, to Jesus, because he's the one they confess in the beginning. And if you notice, the New King James uses the term Christ. I'm not sure about any of the other versions, but I think that was deliberate on the author, because the Greek equivalent to the Hebrew term for Christ is Messiah. And that would remind the Jewish people that Jesus was not only a man, but that he was the long-awaited Messiah that they had long awaited for. And he was prophesied even by Moses. Remember in Deuteronomy 18 and 15, where Moses prophesied of a prophet that was to come as like him. And he reminds them that Jesus is faithful. He never ceases to be faithful in his function as our apostle and our high priest, as we will see in a bit. And this is all a part of his unchanging nature. If you look at chapter 13 in Hebrews, 13 and verse 8. Annette, maybe I'll get you to read that. Chapter 13 and verse 8.
Jesus Christ the same yesterday and today and forever.
Okay, so that just as a reminder. But now he leaves Jesus, okay, and we go to Moses. And he says of Moses that Moses was also faithful in his house. And Moses was the best example of faithfulness to the Hebrews. If you turn back to Numbers, we'll go back to Numbers, the book of Numbers, and we'll go to chapter 12 and verses 6 to 8. And I'll give you all those verses, 6 to 8.
And the Lord said to them, now listen to what I say. If there were prophets among you, I, the Lord, will reveal myself in dreams. I will speak to them in dreams.
Go 7 and 8.
7. But not with my servant Moses, of all my house. He is the only one I trust. I speak to him face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. He sees the Lord as he is. So why were you not afraid to criticize my servant Moses?
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of words there that we'll look into in a minute that helps us see our author's point. But the term house there, first of all, Moses being faithful in his house, simply refers to the nation of Israel. Okay, God's house today is the church. We read that 1 Timothy 3 and verse 15. But in verse 3 of Hebrews 3, as highly as the Jews regarded Moses, and he deserved to be regarded highly because of what he did, but our author says that Christ was worthy. That Christ was worthy of greater honor, of a higher honor. And the comparison used to help people see that was in verse 3, speaking of the builder and a house. What do you think of that comparison? Before I say, Jeff?
Well, God's people are being, as you said, are being compared to a house.
Right.
Israel, God's people, and now the church. Moses is shown as simply a member of God's house. He's faithful in God's house. That was the whole point. Like you said, he had a wonderful position, but he's still part of the house. Jesus is, as verse 6 tells us, he's over his own house.
Right.
He built his house.
Okay.
He sacrificed for his house. The builder
Right.
of the house is always greater than the house itself.
Okay, right.
And greater than Moses.
Okay. Yeah. You jumped ahead on me there. That's where we're going. I want you to think about those words of in Moses' house and then Christ's house. Remember, Christ was over, but keep that thought. We'll touch on it again. But what I was after was the idea of the builder in a house is what Jared?
Most people think Moses built the house. Like as far as the law of Moses. Moses built the Old Testament house. God built the Old Testament house.
Right.
And so that's the difference.
Okay.
At least that's the way I'm seeing it.
Right. And also, when you look at my way of explaining was the idea is the builder of a house, okay, which is the architect, not the laborer. The architect is worthy of more respect than the house itself, okay? I remember years ago when they started building a Hindu temple on 427 and Rexdale Boulevard. And I used to pass it almost every day in the truck. And in the beginning, I saw all these crates, wooden slatted crates that came in on containers from India, because I think the stone is like a soft stone, like a sandstone or something. But anyways, I saw just hundreds of these crates, and then each day I went by, I saw this building was going up. And what amazed me was how are they building? How are they putting these pieces together? How are they making round steeples on top of this building? And when it was finally finished, yeah, it was an impressive sight. But what impressed me more was guys that designed this and made it. And I thought of this comparison here is what the Hebrew writer is having the Jewish brethren understand. Of course, it wasn't a physical building, it was God's building, showing what Moses did and what God did. But verse 4 tells us that God built all things. Okay? He was the builder. And then verse 5 is with verse 4, I just thought, even we see impressive buildings built now, but God God made the universe, spoke the universe. And what is more impressive? What man has built or what God has created? Jay?
And even when you consider what Moses built, the tabernacle, and then later the temple came along, and the Jews revered that. They thought, well, that's the house of God.
Right.
Whereas Christ built a house. Like as far as he built a solid house, it is built on him, which is much better. So, like as far as even with the tabernacle built by Moses and the temple built by Solomon and later on by Herod, it's not as grandiose.
Right.
The Jews stoned Stephen because they thought he spoke against the temple, and all the way through it, he comes along and says the temple is not where God dwells, the Jewish temple. God dwells in the house of his house today, in the church. He dwells with us.
Right.
And will dwell with us more completely in heaven. So, but it's built on Christ.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I'm finding this study's more frustrating as an overview. So when thoughts come into your head of passage we're reading, speak up, because there's so much in this book. It's a book I love to do a textual study on sometimes, especially when you put yourself in the feet of the Jewish people. There's so many contrasts and comparisons made here to help them see. And which verse 5 will bring out some of Jeff and Jeremy's thoughts again. And Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which would be spoken afterward. So we see Moses was faithful in his house, okay, as a servant. And here is Moses' function in God's house under the Old Testament. And we think of in his house as a servant. Think about just as a servant has no authority over the house, okay? The house, or over the house, neither did Moses. Moses didn't have authority over the house. He was faithful in his house. And how do you think we should look at that? Jeremy kind of just mentioned. Moses obeyed what God directed him to do, didn't he? Moses wasn't a ruler per se, as he made the law. Okay, he just simply was faithful to everything that God had directed to him. And now think of Christ. Okay, think of his faithfulness. First of all, we're told that, we know that Moses' house was inferior to the one that Christ resided. But Christ resided over his house, and as Jeff pointed out, he built his house. Okay? Christ built his house, which is the church. And he also, as we read in 1 Corinthians 10, 1-4, and remember this from some of Jeremy's studies in Corinthians, he was also the sustainer of Israel. So as the Jewish people were thinking of Moses and wanting to leave Christ for Moses, Moses was only faithful in his house, which Jesus was faithful over it, and he built it. And when you think of all that, you see, and then also it's the point made at the end of that verse 5. Moses' ministry was nothing but a testimony of the better things yet to come. Go ahead.
Well, Moses' house is built with bricks, mortar, wood, stone.
Is another point, yeah.
Christ's house built on Christ, which is stronger than any of that, which
Right.
cannot be broken.
And it's a spiritual house.
And it's made to stand all these years. It will not be taken down by man.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the spiritual house too, isn't it? Right. That's another good point. And so there's the comparisons used when looked at honestly. Moses isn't being stripped of any of the glory that is due him, but Christ is greater. Christ, the glory and the honor that should be paid to Christ is greater than Moses. And in verse 6 of that, reading the last verse, we see there that again Moses was simply a servant. Okay? But Christ was a son. And a son is more honored than the servant, isn't he? Especially in this case. And then I think, the parallel used here was the word own. Christ over his own house. I did do a little studying into that. That apparently is not in the original manuscripts. This author's point was it's God's house under consideration. Well, either way, we constitute God's house. We're told that 1 Corinthians 3 and 9. And the nation of Israel now no longer composes the house of God. Sure.
Christ is God, so really it doesn't change anything.
Well, that's what I thought.
Yeah, but I said going the rest of the chapter, it was Moses, when Israel disobeyed Moses, Moses, and rebelled against God, consequences came. Well, if Hebrew Christians rebel against Jesus, how much more consequences do you think is going to happen to that? That's why chapter 3 is about Moses. Yeah, Christ is better than Moses. You rebelled against Moses, suffered 40 years in the wilderness. How long are you going to, if you rebel against Christ, go back to Moses? What do you really think you're going to get to the promised land?
Exactly.
And the rest that comes with that.
Yeah. And even thinking of Moses was kept out of the promised land because of his sin. So I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts, Jeff?
Well, if we look at this in context of our overview, which is understanding why these things are there in a broad view of the book, the end of verse 6 is the whole purpose of why the Hebrew writer wrote these things. He said, whose house we are, the church, Christians, Jewish Christians being talked to, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence of that hope firm to the end. That they needed, verse 6, to hold fast to that confidence, that hope that they had in Christ. Because we'll see later in chapter 10, in verse 35,
right,
they were in danger of losing that confidence that they had in Christ. Do not cast, in verse 35, chapter 10, do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. This was in our overview, looking why were these things written? Well, they were in danger of losing their confidence in Christ.
Exactly. Yeah. I had marked down 1 Corinthians 3 and 9 just for the idea of who we are as compared to Moses' house. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. you are God's building. So that the idea
Which verse was that?
of 1 Corinthians,
3 verse 9.
yeah, 1 Corinthians 3 verse 9. So no, there was no question in our lesson on Moses.
I don't know why I'm thinking of when Jesus asked Peter, who do men say that I am? And he said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus told him, you did not reveal this, but my Father who is in heaven revealed it to you. And upon this rock I will build my church or the house, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So it started from the confession.
Right.
I mean, there has to be a revelation in that sense. That I kept thinking about it all the time when you guys are talking. That it started with a confession. God is the one who revealed it, and it is so.
Exactly. Yeah. And when you think of, I think maybe the Hebrew writer was trying to have them remember back, when you make a confession, at the moment you make it, you based it on facts. It's at that moment there's nothing that could sway your thinking. From what has been presented to you, it's right. It's the bottom line. But see, then after a while of being influenced and the pressure maybe these Jewish brethren were under, being persecuted by maybe fellow Jewish brethren, and then all of a sudden you forget that confession. Your mind starts swaying to other points, and that's a good point. I think the Hebrew writer was trying to bring them back to that moment. Remember what you did and why you did it, as opposed to now. Now you're wanting to change. It's a good point. Well, there's no other thoughts on Moses. We'll go back to question 7 then. We did look at our first one a bit. Our author begins there by stating that Christ had to be made like his brethren in all things. I started thinking about this verse again and what I had always thought of. Jesus participated in our nature and our sufferings on earth. And he experienced the lure of sin. But as I thought about that, I thought, did he do that to see if he could do it sinlessly? Think of Jeff's lesson there a while back in 1 John. Did Jesus, he took on the human role, but did he have to do that so he could see if he could do it sinlessly?
No, but he showed man that man could follow the law.
Right.
Man has always come along and tried to make an excuse. Well, I'm weak, or I'm tempted, and therefore I can't follow the law. There's a difference between saying, I can't follow the law, and I don't follow the law. Like as far as I've fallen from the law. Christ took the excuse away. No, you can follow this law. Because he was tempted.
Yeah.
He was tempted like we are. He can sympathize with our weaknesses, but he didn't sin. He didn't have to prove it to anyone. He knew he could.
Right.
But he showed mankind that you could, that God wasn't being unreasonable.
Okay. But I was thinking along, that's right.
Yeah.
No doubt, that's right. The verse that Jeff had come to my mind was 1 John 3 and verse 5, when I asked the question, did Jesus have to come to earth as a man, as us, to see if he could do it without sinning? Well, 1 John 3 and 5 says, and you know that he was manifested to take away our sins. Okay, we know that. and in him there is no sin. He didn't come here to this earth to see if he could do. He was God. There is no sin in God. There's no way that's possible. And then coming up to Jeremy's thoughts, I said, did he do this so he could understand our weaknesses? Did he have to come to know that? And I thought of a passage, Psalms 139. And this all leads up to my thought here. Psalms 139, the first 4 verses. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. So I took us to that passage. It seems to me that Jesus, God, understands man's thinking, understands our weaknesses, and he could have done that even if he had stayed in heaven. Okay? But when I think of the high priest, the Levitical priesthood, and Christ as our priesthood, kind of goes with Jair's thought, but by coming to earth, he demonstrated to us. It wasn't any need on his part. This was for us. He demonstrated to us that he could understand our circumstances through his personal first-hand experience. It was all for our thinking, our trust in Jesus. And I had the little comparison of it's one thing to be a great leader, okay, and to sit and tell others to do extremely difficult tasks, okay, but it's another thing for that leader to show others that it can be done, okay, and that was kind of Jair's thought, and how to do it. It was for our purpose, because sometimes we can think that, well, and I've heard that, well, Jesus come to see if he could do it. No, he didn't. There's no sin in God. He knew what man was like.
That's an interesting way of putting it. Hebrews 4:15 is the one we're dancing around.
Oh, okay.
For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. We could turn to God and say, yes, you have never been tempted, because God is not tempted with evil, nor does he tempt man with evil. James 1 tells us that.
Right.
God has not experienced temptation in heaven, so man could look up to God, well, you don't know. And Christ would say, yes, I do.
Right.
And it takes our excuse away. That God doesn't know, God's in heaven, God's aloof, God doesn't understand.
Right.
Whereas God does. He did before, and I think your point is well taken. That he did, but demonstrating it, he takes away all manner of excuse that we might have.
Right.
Because he was tempted like us.
Right. I think the reason I started thinking that way was because the Hebrew writer is wanting us to understand Christ is our high priest. He's a merciful. He's compassionate. So when we're struggling, we need to look to Christ and understand that he's mediating on our behalf. And this, by no means, it goes with, I think Jair's thought a couple weeks ago, or it might have been Brian's in the gospel meeting. I forget now. But habitual sinning. Okay? We're not going to find forgiveness for habitual sinning all the time. If you're if you're struggling with a sin and you do it every day, and we ask forgiveness every day, there's going to come to a point where we will not find forgiveness for that. But we also need to understand that Christ understands our weaknesses, our thinking. He is compassionate. That should motivate us to put our trust in him as our mediator, as our high priest. Let's not be afraid in the sense.
That makes Jesus' high priesthood different than the Levitical priesthood. Go back to the Day of Atonement. First thing the high priest did was offer sin sacrifice for himself,
right,
and then came back for the people. Whereas the Hebrew writer in Hebrews 4 is saying Christ is without sin. He doesn't have to offer that sacrifice.
right.
He offered the sacrifice for sin once for all, but he didn't have to do that for himself. That makes it that goes to our question: why is it superior? We have a better high priest.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we'll look at Hebrews 4. Hebrews 4 and verse 14.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, that's all right. Where were we? Barbara, do you want to read Hebrews 4 and verse 14? And then Lisa, I'll give you chapter 5 and verse 4. That was Lisa? Okay.
That was Barbara.
Okay. So back to thinking in the shoes of the Jewish people.
You can get verse 4, though.
Oh,
Are you wanting verse 4 right away?
did we not get verse 4?
No, Lisa didn't get that.
Oh,
We had
sorry.
Barbara.
Lisa, chapter 5 and verse 4.
You got it.
Oh, okay. I forgot to turn the fan off up here, so hearing is
I'm
obsolete.
I'm helpful to you.
Oh, yeah. I look to Jared for the finger.
That's terrible.
Well, for his finger like this waist.
Given-
Let's
That's terrible.
okay, back to our thought here. The Jews, thinking of the high priest, okay, they greatly value their high priest. And so our writer is reminding them here, okay, of the confession they'd made, that they have a greater high priest. And what does he first say there about our greater high priest? Where has he passed? Where's
Through the heavens.
right, Jeff? Yeah, he's passed through the physical heavens, and he's seated at the right hand of God. Didn't say that exactly in that verse, but we know that. So then, thinking to the Levitical priests, what happens to them at the end of their life, Jeff? The end of their life.
So they died.
Right, that's all. Yeah. They're dead. They die. They die and they're buried. And then the next in line fulfills that duty, fulfills that place. And the author is having them to consider, first of all, Christ is not dead. He's passed through the heavens. He's been resurrected, and he's at the right hand of God. Jeff?
I thought there might have been also a slight comparison there to what the high priest would do once a year. Going into the most holy place, he'd pass through that veil, where none others could go. But when you think about it, it's just an earthly temple. I mean, the temple was a great thing, but it's still an earthly temple. It's an earthly veil, and passes through. Jesus passed through the kind of like the veil of the heavens.
Right.
Separating us from God's eternal home. Wow, that's way greater than what the earthly high priest did.
Right. With that thought, if they were thinking the high priest goes through that veil into the Holy of Holies only once a year, into the presence of God. Christ has gone through the heavens, and like you say, not an earthly tabernacle, the earthly veil. He's now in heaven at the right hand of God. And all the time, continually, isn't it? That's why I say when Jared,
Because of that sacrifice, he's there. Now he was there before, but
right,
but that sacrifice is not offered every day, every year. It's once, one sacrifice. He's in the presence of God, acting as priest today, high priest today. The sacrifices are over.
right, exactly. And when we think of Aaron didn't decide that he and his descendants were going to take the role of high priest. That wasn't a decision made by Aaron. His position was appointed by God, wasn't it, as high priest? Only Aaron and his descendants. And for the Jewish people now, Jesus wasn't a descendant of Aaron. Yet his glory and his honor as high priest wasn't self-appointed in that sense. He was called of God to that position. Okay? And the glory spoken of here in that verse is the glory through being set in that position. And I see that as what we are to see. So the Hebrew brethren and we are encouraged to remain faithful and don't renounce the one that we believed in the first place. And all these comparisons, like I say, we need to step into the shoes of the Jewish people and see what the writer is trying to have them see. But by doing that, then we see the great privilege that's been to us, given to us.
I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord